It was the kind of evening that promised more than just the chill of autumn. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The kind of stillness that made the trees seem like they were holding their breath. Emma, a wild 9-year-old girl with wide eyes and an unshakable curiosity, loved it. The autumn woods behind her family's farm had always fascinated her. But her parents, especially her mother, had always warned her to stay away. "You don't know what's out there, Emma," her mother would say, a look of quiet dread in her eyes. "Those trees, they hide things." Emma had heard the story, of course. The story about Lucas. He'd been her age when he disappeared, years ago, during the same crisp autumn days when the leaves began to fall. The search parties combed the woods for weeks, but the boy was never found. Some said he'd run off, that kids sometimes got lost and wandered too far. Others said the woods were cursed, that they called to people, drawing them deeper and deeper until there was no way back. Emma, however, wasn't afraid. She wasn't like other kids who'd listen to the stories and cower. Emma had an unshakable belief that the whispers in the woods weren't just myths. She was certain of it. It started small, just faint murmurs, barely audible over the rustling of the trees. But by the time the days grew shorter and the sun set earlier, Emma could hear them clearly. They called her name. "Emma! Emma!" She would lie in bed, wide-eyed, listening to the sounds outside her window, the whispers coming from the woods behind the house. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it was different. The wind didn't say her name. The wind didn't ask for her. Her mother, seeing the way Emma stared out the window with a distant, far-off expression, finally sat her down. "Emma, you have to listen to me," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Stay out of the woods. Don't go near them after dark." Emma rolled her eyes, as children do when they believe they know better. "I'm not scared, Mom." Her mother's gaze grew more intense. "It's not about being scared. Those woods, they're wrong. People have disappeared in those woods. Not just Lucas, others, too. You're not to go there." Emma's eyes narrowed, and she stubbornly crossed her arms. "It's just trees." But deep down, Emma knew something was different about those woods. Something wasn't right. The first time Emma went missing, it wasn't her parents' fault. They warned her not to go out there. But it was dusk, the kind of night where the sun dipped behind the horizon in a fiery haze, and the shadows grew long and deep. Emma slipped out of the house when no one was looking, drawn to the call she could no longer ignore. Her father, Mark, was working in the barn when he first noticed the absence. He called out for Emma, his voice sharp with concern when he realized she was nowhere to be found. The panic set in fast. His boots crunched through the dry grass as he ran toward the woods. He found the first set of prints just beyond the edge of the clearing. Small and child-sized, they led into the woods, curving toward the dark, gaping mouth of the trees. But after a few dozen paces, the footprints suddenly stopped. And that's when Mark felt it, the air change. It wasn't the crisp, familiar autumn breeze anymore. The air felt heavy, lit with something otherworldly. His breath hitched in his throat as he scanned the woods. It was as if the trees were closing in on him. And then, he saw it. A massive paw print in the dirt, far larger than anything a normal animal would leave. The toes were clawed, the edges ragged and jagged. His heart raced as he crouched down to examine it. It looked wrong, like something was pretending to be an animal. The whispers, faint at first, grew louder. They weren't in his head, they were coming from the trees. They were calling for Emma. Mark's stomach twisted as he called out her name again, but the answer came not from Emma, but from the woods themselves. "Come closer, Mark. You'll find her." It wasn't until the next morning, when Mark was about to start the search again, that Emma came stumbling out of the woods. It was still dark, the sun not yet risen, and Emma appeared on the porch like a ghost, thin, pale, and disheveled. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt and twigs. Her eyes were wide, but it wasn't fear in them. It was something else. Something strange, Emma didn't speak at first. She didn't cry. She just stood there, looking at her parents, as if nothing had happened. Her mother rushed forward, throwing her arms around her. "Where were you? We've been searching for you," she cried, but Emma didn't respond. She simply stared at her with those unsettling, hollow eyes. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "They're waiting for you, too," she said, before falling silent again. Her gaze shifted toward the trees behind the house, a slight tilt of her head as though someone, was out there, watching her. That night, Emma wouldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out into the woods, her lips barely moving as she murmured to herself. Occasionally, she would whisper something too low to hear, her fingers twitching as if she were tracing invisible shapes in the air. The next week, when the first frost touched the ground, Emma went missing again. Her parents were frantic, calling her name, searching the woods for hours, but it was as though the forest had swallowed her whole. They could find no trace of her, not a footprint, not a sign of struggle. Days passed, then weeks. The police came, the search widened, but Emma was gone. And then, just as before, a week later, at the stroke of midnight, she returned. But this time, she didn't walk to the porch. No, this time she stood at the edge of the woods, waiting. Her form barely visible in the moonlight. Her parents rushed to her, but she didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes were cold, empty, and the whispering was back, louder now, echoing in the trees. Emma finally turned to face them. "They're here, too. They're waiting for you." And then, as if on cue, a figure stepped out from the shadows behind her. Something impossibly tall, its face hidden in the shadows, its limbs too long, too twisted. It watched them without moving. Without blinking. Her parents screamed, but the whispers grew louder, filling their ears, drowning out everything else. And just before the figure reached them, Emma's voice echoed, too. "They never leave? They never let you go?" The lights went out. The next morning, Emma's parents were gone. There were no signs of struggle. The house was perfectly still. And in the woods, if you listen closely, you can still hear Emma's voice, calling for someone else to come closer. "Come play with us. The trees are waiting."